Welcome back to BYoungMinistry.com, to another blog and to another podcast. We continue today in our study of the book of Hebrews. We're in chapter 5, verses 5 through 10, which reads, "In the same way, Christ did not take on himself the glory of becoming a high priest. But God said to him, 'You are my son. Today I have become your father.' And he says in another place, 'You are a priest forever, in the order of Melchizedek.' During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered. And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, and was designated by God to be high priest in the order of Melchizedek." That's Hebrews chapter 5, verses 5 through 10. We return today to our study of the book of Hebrews in chapter 5, wherein, having explained the requirements of the Old Testament high priest, the writer of Hebrews introduces us to the only one who is truly qualified to be high priest before God on the behalf of sinful man, the Lord Jesus Christ. In verse 5 of today's passage we read, "In the same way, Christ did not take on himself the glory of becoming a high priest, but God said to him, 'You are my son. Today I have become your father.'" The writer of Hebrews begins this verse with "in the same way," pointing us back to the previous verses where he established the three requirements for a high priest. Christ was selected by God from among the people. God the Father chose his Son to be the high priest of all who would believe that his sacrifice on the cross paid the penalty of God's wrath for our sin in full. Then in verse 5, the writer of Hebrews quotes Psalm 2:7, where we read, "You are my son. Today I've become your father." The writer of Hebrews consistently quotes the Old Testament because he wrote to Jews who were well acquainted with the Old Testament, and he was maximizing their understanding. By quoting Psalm 2:7, the writer showed the Lord Jesus fulfilled the first requirement as high priest. The Lord Jesus was called and was appointed by God to come to earth to die for hopeless man. In verse 6 of today's passage, we read, "You are a priest forever, in the order of Melchizedek." The same God that said, "You are my son," is the same God that said, "You are a priest." In fact, this verse is a quotation from Psalm 110 in verse 4, which reads, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." God himself ordained the Lord Jesus to be the high priest, thus fulfilling the first requirement of a priest. Now, Melchizedek is spoken of in Psalm 110, which provides a prophecy of the coming of Messiah. And Melchizedek was an Old Testament type of Christ. We were first introduced to him in Genesis chapter 14 and verse 18, long before Aaron was ever made high priest. The priesthood of Melchizedek superseded the priesthood of Aaron in many ways, as we will see. Thus, Christ is greater than Aaron. In Genesis chapter 14 and verse 18, we read, "Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High." Melchizedek was the king of Salem, the original name of Jerusalem. And he brought out bread and wine in connection with his high priestly duties. The bread and wine was a slight pullback of the curtain, a hint of what was to come. Like Melchizedek, the Lord Jesus has always been the king priest. Melchizedek was a type of Christ's eternal priesthood. There is no record of his birth or death. It is as if he has always existed. And you know what? He has always existed. When we study Hebrews 7, we will learn just that. In verse 7 of today's passage, we read, "During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission." The Lord Jesus not only fit the first qualification of the high priest, this verse informs us he fulfilled the second. He is empathetic with mankind. The Lord Jesus offered up prayers and petitions. He also cried fervent cries and tears. The Lord Jesus Christ could not have been a fully empathetic high priest if he had not have come to earth as a baby and grew up to be a man. He spent his days on earth feeling what we feel. The Garden of Gethsemane was the greatest climax of the suffering of the Lord Jesus, for there he began to bear the sins of the world. There he felt the crush of sin when he went into the garden to pray. There he agonized over the looming cross. He prayed to the one who could save him from death. The word translated "from" is the word "ek" in the Greek, which means out from within. The Lord Jesus did not pray, "God, don't let me die." He prayed, "Father, once I get into this, get me out of it." Here the Lord Jesus was praying for his resurrection. He prayed to him who was able to save him out of death. He did not pray to escape death, for that was why he was born. He prayed to be saved out of death. He knows anguish like we do. In fact, he knows anguish like we do not. We have and never will approach this type of pain. In verses 8 through 10 of today's passage, we read, "Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered. And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, and was designated by God to be high priest in the order of Melchizedek." The Lord Jesus obviously struggled to obey the Father as he moved closer to his cross. He had to go through with the sacrifice. And even though he was God's son, he learned by suffering. This is the only way we truly learn. When we learn by experience. We could say something hurts us, but until we have experienced the pain, we really can't be empathetic with someone who has been burned. Empathy comes from experiencing what someone else has experienced. This is how the Lord Jesus learned obedience. He endured the unwanted suffering and pain. By the way, when we read, "Once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him," it does not mean he was made perfect. It means the salvation he came to provide us was made perfect. And by his death, the perfect Lord Jesus fulfilled the third requirement to be our high priest. He sacrificed for the people. The Lord Jesus Christ opened the way of eternal salvation for all humble enough to believe. All the priests of all time couldn't provide eternal salvation. They could provide temporary forgiveness, one sacrifice at a time. But only Christ was able to seal the deal for eternity. And the death he died once and for all, for those who have believed in him. The Lord Jesus Christ became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. It was the death, burial, and resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ that justified us before God. And once we have been justified and born again, God begins his sanctification work in us. And when we obey him, we are yielding to his sanctification. Our obedience will be there if we know him as our Father. It will never be perfect this side of heaven, but it will be there because he lives in us. My friends, I trust this blog and this podcast are helping you in your walk with the Lord. If I can be of further assistance to you, shoot me an email at BYoungMinistry@gmail.com. Hey, have a great